for us, assisting population requires that we need to be accepted by all warring parties, by national governments, by armed opposition groups, by international forces, by criminal gangs, by warlords, by everybody who has some influence in the area. And to give you an example, we have started operations recently in Helmand province in Afghanistan, Helmand being the epicenter of the conflict in the south at the moment. And we spent months before starting operation securing acceptance from the Taliban, from the government at local and central level, from the forces of the coalition, the community leaders, the warlords, etc. Because in our view, one of the key elements of this acceptance is to be recognized by all stakeholders as neutral and impartial in our action of providing health care. And we need to be perceived as an organization whose actions are only motivated by the wish to provide this medical and life support assistance. And we should not be perceived as somebody who has any interest in any or any party who is supposed to win the war. So we want to be totally disconnected from any political, religious, judicial, military agenda, and we want to base our decisions on to intervene on an independent assessment of the need. But although these principles of neutrality, independence, impartiality, which are not just MSF principles, they are, humanitarian law principles, right? They are absolutely fundamental to us, but we're not that candid. We know that it's not just by claiming that we are neutral that we would be perceived as such. And we know that it's only by demonstrating the usefulness of our operations every day on the ground through medical action that the humanitarian actors can regain some space for action. But what's happening today, ironically, is that being accepted by the belligerents tends to be much more difficult in the countries where UN or Western powers operate, especially in Afghanistan, for example. And Iraq, they are also a good illustration of the situation. So the reason is very simple. The reason is that our organization originates from the same countries, right, which decide and fund UN and Western-led military operations, or countries that send troops there. This is why our claim to act independently is usually considered with strong skepticism. But this skepticism is even stronger when warring parties claim to be humanitarian and when aid workers or the aid system takes part in the war itself. It makes things even more complicated, as if it was not enough complicated. So first, trust is eroded when the UN or Western forces, they claim to use military force on behalf of humanitarian concern, when counter-insurgency operations aiming at winning the heart and minds of the population are carried out under the disguise of impartial humanitarian operations, when the military declares that there is a unity of purposes between humanitarian NGOs and occupation forces, when they call NGOs force multipliers, when they call them a part of our combat team. We hear that every day, right, in the press. I think we've read that in Foreign Affairs sometimes too. When they call NGOs a source of information, as Mr. Orbrook recently stated. The very idea of a humanitarian war for us is quite detrimental to the humanitarian enterprise as a whole. And it's also very detrimental to the democratic debate, actually. We well understand the need for intervening countries to gather popular support. That's perfectly legitimate. Yet the idea of humanitarian war appears to us as a dangerous diversion of the humanitarian project. This idea is in total contradiction with the original project, that is, to limit the devastation of war, to diminish the impact of violence, and not to advocate for or justify new wars. our purpose is really, has always been to civilize war, not to wage a war of civilization. So if humanitarian actors like Doctors Without Borders, and we're not the only one, we're not pacifists, we are strongly committed to a pacific mode of action. And for us, shoot to feed or shoot to heal is not part of our modus operandi. But as medical doctors, do not harm, do no harm is definitely our major concern. But beyond this deontological concern, there is also a pragmatic one, which is that we believe that acceptance that would rely on force only is highly volatile. And as far as we are concerned, we consider that negotiation is the most secure way to gain access to the population and to conduct safe operations. The experience of Somalia between 92 and 95 is quite telling in that regard. The moment international troops started to shoot at civilians in order to safeguard aid deliveries, at that very moment we became parties to the conflict. And at that moment we became exposed to an unbearable insecurity which has never stopped since then. So this is one of the first concerns when there is a use of humanitarian rhetoric by the military. And then the second problem, which reinforced the skepticism, is when the United Nations don't play their role as a neutral broker, but when they have already chosen their side, as it is the case in Afghanistan, where the UNAMA is committed to support the government and to defeat the armed opposition group. And then what is worse is that it's not worse, what is problematic is that the majority of this aid system has chosen to work along UN lines in Afghanistan as an implementing partner. But it's not just in Afghanistan. In Pakistan, I visited this country in July, and at that time there were 2 million refugees fleeing from the Swat Valley. And 80% of the displaced people were scattered in communities. The refugee camp, which had been organized, only hosted 20% of this displaced population. But more than 90% of the international assistance, however, was concentrated in the camps. So, it's in these circumstances, it's very hard for organizations to claim that they are neutral, independent, that they are solely driven by needs, right? Because there is such a disconnect between the needs and the reality of aid. However, the partiality, because there is a problem of partiality of UN and the aid system, is not condemnable per se, as long as it does not preclude impartial agencies such as Doctors Without Borders or the International Red Cross to provide and to deliver assistance in an impartial way. If we oppose the notion of humanitarian war and these blurring lines, it's because it's introducing a continuity between the impartial provision of health care and the agenda of reconstruction. It's not that we are against this approach, because the aid system is very diverse, and the vast majority of aid agencies have much broader objectives than ours, and than just limiting the devastation of war. They are geared toward supporting peace, good governance, justice, sustainable development, gender equality, etc. And all these causes are very legitimate ones, right? And some of these agencies consider that international military intervention is certainly the best vehicle to achieve these objectives. This is, for example, the case in Afghanistan, when a consortium of 80 aid agencies in 2003 called on the international community for the expansion of NATO ISAF mandate and resources, because they claim that it would allow democracy to flourish, right? So within this paradigm, it makes perfect sense for aid agencies to contribute to the international war effort. But of course, by doing so, they take the risk of supporting flawed policies, and this policy might backfire and might result in more violence for the population.